become more purpose-driven and hopefully educate the next generation of responsible leaders. Thank you so much.
Christian, thank you so much. I can't get out of my head the idea that, that our challenge is to seek to graduate MIM students who are not only comfortable with ambiguity, but who use postmodern meaning making as a way to navigate through ambiguity in a responsible way. Just to remind you, you'll have lots of opportunity to ask questions of both of our keynote speakers a little later. Right now, though, what I'd like to do is to introduce to you our second keynote speaker, Dr. Sandra Peter. Sandra is a colleague of mine from the business school at Sydney University. She specialises in overseeing our school's Sydney Business Insights program, and she's committed to taking an engaged, relevant and influential approach to our school's engagement with major issues and trends. She's really the cutting edge of what we're seeking to do there in terms of engaging with mega trends in and beyond the campus. Sandra has research degrees in both business and education. Her research is focused on the future of higher education, and in particular business education, from a learner perspective. She examines access to education through initiatives like open learning, open education resources and MOOCs, and she's also interested in the broader economic, socio-cultural and related aspects of higher education. She examines how such phenomena are nested in society and in various public debates and discourses, rather than seeing education as a socially disembodied and disengaged phenomenon. Sandra has a keen interest in innovation in business education from a practical applied perspective. That includes blended and flipped practices, new forms of assessment, yes, pop-ups and hackathons and the like. She has extensive teaching experience in business management, international business, management consulting, design thinking and related fields. She's implemented a range of innovative educational practices and initiatives, including teaching in a program called Refugees in Business in Australia, and in a program that we offer called The Future of Business. She's currently investigating how societal discourses and debates shape how we experience manifestations of megatrends. I think that's the post-structuralist, if I can still use that phrase, approach coming to the fore again, in and around things such as MOOCs, disruptive innovation, and self-driving cars, etc. So, Sandra, please take the stage. What I want to do is invite you to give us your pearls of wisdom on how business education is being transformed. And I think she's now wired to do exactly that. Please make her welcome.
Thanks, John. I think I am. Whoa, hard act to follow. Just by way of introduction, I'm one of those people that Christian mentioned. I'm the first one out there dancing, always. I'm also very, very jet-lagged. It's about 11 p.m. in Australia, and it's my first half a day here, so please bear with me as I try to bridge the distance between the two. So I'm going to follow on from what Christian has said, and I'm going to try to cover two things today, and that's pretty much it. First is, what do we prepare our students for? So Christian has started telling us about the world, this new world that we live in. I'm going to try to drill a little bit more into that. And then I'm going to talk about how do we do it. And this is going to include lessons learned from the University of Sydney Business School. Some were learned harder than others, I must say. So first is, what are we preparing our students for? And obviously the world that Christian described is very different to what I studied maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago, 2 years ago. Very different. So I'm going to start with, this is from one of our presenters, was a guy from Atlassian, which is the only Australian unicorn, sort of over $1 billion company. It's now at about $8.5 billion. Said, Sandra, when you want to nail it, always start with a big statistic. So I've got a big statistic, a very cool big statistic, which is 90%. And I could use it to tell any story, and they would all be true. First one would be that 90% of the parts that go into the car and the way your car is manufactured is now done by robots. I could tell you the 90% story where 90% of the trades being done by next year will be done by algorithms, not by people. I could tell you stories about how industry is changing. I said, if you don't have a cool statistic, at least have a really cool number, have a big number. So I've got 100, which is how long those of us who are 20 will live. That's the life expectancy. If you're 40, unlike me, if you're 40, you will live to be 95, but if you're born today, you'll live to be 105. And if that's not a big enough number, this is the world we're gonna live in. I've got an even cooler, even bigger number, which is 1 trillion, which is how many connected devices we will have, Internet of Things. So that's the world that we're going into, sharing economy, changing values. Well, we're preparing our students also for work, and that is changing rapidly as well. And if we look at the types of jobs that are declining, a lot of the routine cognitive and routine non-cognitive work is declining, but a lot of what we thought of as finance or accounting or marketing is becoming routine cognitive work. So they're on the decline, but we see this huge rise in routine cognitive work. We're thinking, okay, Sandra, that sounds interesting, but we're not really scared. If we look at what jobs are being replaced, we're in those countries where not a lot of it, maybe about 50% of these jobs are being replaced. Many of the tasks in these jobs are changing. But this is the story in the middle. We're hollowing out the middle if we look at the jobs that we're preparing students for. We're gonna have non-routine cognitive work, really creative, really fantastic work where you find all of those values, where you find meaning in your work, and we will have domestic work. As good as we are at making artificial intelligence and robots, we couldn't figure one out who can serve you a really nice steak in a restaurant. That will take a very long time to replace, as will jobs like mine or all the other people in this room, right? But in the middle, we're seeing a big hollowing out, and that's eating up the works in the middle. So what's changing? If we're looking at this world, well, a lot of things are changing. We have fundamentally disappearing jobs, right? Things that will no longer exist. And some of those professions we're teaching students right now, we know they're gonna disappear. The life cycle of skills is changing. We're learning things and they're obsolete in 5 years or in 3 years. How do we adjust to that? Then the pathways into professions or organizations are changing, and we're not recognizing that enough. If we bring in algorithms, if we bring in robotics, how is, for instance, the law industry changing, the finance industry changing, the insurance industry changing, where all of those routine cognitive works which will socialize you into that industry, they're all disappearing. What do we do about the structures of the professions? Then we used to think about as careers, we're preparing students for careers. Well, maybe we're just preparing them for tasks or for jobs, or maybe careers are just one day and then I move on to the other one. In the sharing economy, we also share work. We have the gig economy where I can get a job for a day working for the CIA or working for NASA, and then I take a week off. That happens a lot to me. Meaning of work, how is that changing? We spoke a lot about finding those values, but quite often those values are no longer found at work. If we look at things like the gig economy, I go to work in one place, but I find meaning somewhere else. We have gig platforms like 10X, where people, the best coders in the world, find that work from NASA or from the CIA. And they go and work, and there's a camera on them, like there is one on me now. They film you for the entire duration of that work. You finish it, but then you find meaning in other platforms where you share your expertise with communities of practice. That's not paid, and we don't recognize it as work. So how is that changing? And then lifelong learning and everything else that Christian has mentioned before. Okay, so this is probably more of what we're preparing students for. So if this is what we're preparing them for, then how are we doing it? Well, things are no longer black and white. I know at these conferences people expect me to come up and say, we've got 3 answers. This is the first one, the second one, the third one. They all work, you all go ahead and implement it in your work. But we need to thrive in subjectivity and ambiguity. And as a researcher and as an educator, I say publicly that I like those words. I probably don't like those words, and we don't like to hear them in a classroom, but that's exactly what we need to prepare for. Companies expect people who can thrive in those conditions, and we know, we ask them, we talk to them, and you guys talk to them all the time. We also want people who are able to synthesize multiple perspectives. Well, we need to bring them to them, who are able to think about the bigger questions, and I'll come back to the bigger questions because this is one of my pet peeves. People who can quickly synthesize information and tell it to you in a language that you can understand. Now, in that space, what we do at the University of Sydney Business School is we recognize that what we need to instill in our students are 3 things. We need to give them a set of skill sets that will change quite rapidly, but we need to teach them and teach them how to learn. We need to give them a set of tools, and those tools might be obsolete by the time they leave university, but at least they know how to use some tools. But most importantly, we need to give them a set of mindsets. And what goes into how we shape those mindsets has fundamentally changed, as Kristen has started saying. So what I'll do for the rest of the presentation is I'll go through a few of these ideas of how we change, how we reimagine business education. These are all things that we've tried out and we encourage people to try out with us. The first one is big questions. The first thing, big questions. Christian has told you about a world that is changing rapidly. In that world that is changing rapidly, one of the fundamental responsibilities we have is to start developing with our students a collective understanding of what some of the problems that we are faced with are and what some of those opportunities are. And universities are those places for asking the really big questions. And if we're not asking big questions, we need to be asking bigger questions. There's such a huge push now for everything to be applied, practice-led, industry integrated, all our projects that we do with our partners. But we need to have time to also think about the big questions. They're getting left behind. At the University of Sydney Business School, we do that by focusing on what we call megatrends, these big 25, 50-year trends. Influential technology, evolving communities, changing demographics, rapid urbanization, the fact that most of us live in cities now, and most of our GDP is created in cities. Empowered individuals, Christian has talked a lot about them. Things like economic power shift and the tensions that we're seeing now. Things like resource security, everything from water to food to energy security, but also things like the phosphorus crisis and so on. Big questions. And these megatrends for us at the University of Sydney Business School, they play out in different ways, right? We look at concrete manifestations, but we still ask the big questions. We talk about autonomous vehicles, right? A lot of us talk about self-driving cars, it's in the news all the time. But we can take a step back and ask our students, if this is the world that we live in, if a child now runs out in front of that car, who decides whether the car kills the child or kills me as a passenger by driving it into a tree? Is it the car company? Is it Uber? Is it the programmer? Is it me as a customer because I decided to buy a Mercedes and decided to pay all that money to make sure it's me every single time who survives the accident? Who gets to think about that? And what we challenge our students with is not that that's the question, but the question becomes complicated because how that gets decided is now in a black box. Because we have complex algorithms that make up their own languages and their own decision-making systems. And we've seen this with Google translating things from one language to another and inventing its own language in the middle. What if we no longer know what happens in the box? How can we then make ethical decisions in that space? And we ask our students those questions. And they're not practice-led questions where we embed them in an organization, but we have them think about it. We ask them these big questions because it's a completely different world. So last week, Tencent passed Wells Fargo to become the 10th biggest company in the world. Who knows what Tencent's famous for? WeChat, yes, WeChat. And WeChat is completely different from what we use, from Viber, from WhatsApp, from everything else, right? On WeChat, you can check your school records and pay your fines and order food at the restaurant before you get there. Or you can hire a cat therapist or talk to your friends, all of these things, and they look at our apps and go, oh my God, what is that? Right? That's the world we live in. And we need to be able to ask those questions because companies that are successful in our world are not necessarily successful in that future world. What do these two companies have in common? They both failed in China miserably, right? They failed because Taobao decided that selling is a bit more social than we thought, that ride-sharing is something where you have to have strong connections with the local government, or as one of my students said, because to be successful in China, you need an orange logo, which I then corrected by then telling them I've added that the next week. I said no Home Depot has an orange logo, and it was not successful in China. But IKEA has a blue and yellow one and was successful in China because selling is about something else there, right? What does that world look like? So big questions is my first item. My second question is teach for ambiguity. I know you don't like it. I don't like it. But teach for that ambiguity and embrace it. Teach with it and for it. One of my favorite slides. Anyone here from Harvard? No, I can have a field day. My Flipboard, right? A few months ago, I opened it up, and there are the two stories next to each other. One of them was performance-based pay for executives still works. Yay! Next page is stop paying executives for performance. So shit, what do I do now? This is the ambiguity in which we live. We don't know what tools work, and we don't know how they work, but we need to embrace it, and we need to teach it to our students. So when questions like this come up, we need to go back to the basics. It's very simple. When you can teach in that ambiguity. Go back to the basics. One of the things we're working now at the University of Sydney Business School and Sydney Business Insights, and I encourage you to participate, is decide on the groundwork. How do we develop collective understandings? We all talk about artificial intelligence. How many of you can confidently stand up now in the room and tell me what that is? Artificial intelligence is, and give me a working definition of it. Imagine our students when really that tweet comes up and says that Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg can agree on what it is, then how can we? So how do we decide that? So we do explainers, where we expose that ambiguity. We don't try to hide it or give it a name. We expose that ambiguity. Same things with things like collaborative or sharing economy. As Christian has said, there's so many kinds of it, with different rules, with different ways of engaging, with different benefits and threats. While the gig economy that I mentioned before, Tencent, empowers people where it gives them really interesting work for NASA or everything else, Uber is also in the gig economy, where I clock in, I do my work, I go home. I clock in, I do my work, I go home, until they find a way to replace me. They're both of the same kind. So we embrace that. And my favorite one, robots will take our jobs. What's a robot? Is it an algorithm? Is it a Dalek? Is it C3PO? I hope it's all of these things, by the way. But how do we decide what they are? Because we can't teach students in that space unless we start a conversation there. So we're unsure about the tools that will work, performance-based for executives. We are unsure of the tools that will work. At this point, by the way, I have a gratuitous picture of a cat in my presentation just to make sure that everybody's still paying attention to what I'm saying. We are unsure of the tools that will work, but we try to bring tools in. We bring in things like design thinking, but what none of us say is that design thinking is actually a practice-led theory, right? It's a practice-led framework. It's not something that we sat down and academics did a lot of research, decided what it is. Is it product? Is it context? Is it the methodology? No. It was led by practice, and we brought it in before we figured out exactly how it works and why it works and what it is. We can't agree on it, and in the Academy of Management journal, we can't even write about it. But we bring in these tools, and if practice is ahead of us, we find ways of embracing that ambiguity and bringing it right back in. So we have things like design thinking, which helps us go into this new world, which helps us, puts us in their shoes, right? If they're using WeChat, what does that look like? And we manage to embrace it. Okay, so I said big questions. I said teach with ambiguity. And the next one is speed to capability. I can't stress this enough. Agile learning. We need to teach our students to learn extremely fast, but also to unlearn. As important as it is for them to learn, it is to unlearn. Some of our students get stuck with the models that we teach them because we tell them, no, it's not ambiguous. This is what works. You need to go ahead and then find nails that fit your hammer, right? And I always start with this, the sexiest management theory to come out in 20 years, right? And the word of the day and our favorite things, and God. Disruptive innovation, right? And we tell our students, we put up a picture of Christensen and we tell them this is what disruptive innovation is and this is how the theory works. And we have some problems with the theory, but this is what happens. And then you teach it, and then in the middle of semester, this happens. And the sexiest management theory for the last 20 years is dead. And then you embrace it, you take it apart, and then you teach that to the students. This is what's gonna happen to every tool we give you, and this is how you question the assumptions. When the next one comes out, this is how you integrate what you've learned. And if it's just a nice metaphor, disruption, then that's what it is, but you know what it is and you know what you can do with it if other people use it. And we embrace this. We teach them that if the tool comes out, we can make it better, because we will need to. Things like blockchain, right? How many of you teach blockchain? Yay! Please talk to me after this. So things like blockchain, how do we embrace that quickly? Because it's changing the landscape in which our students exist, but most of us can't talk about it. And if we do we truly understand what it can do? Yes, it will revolutionize everything, really, but how quickly? Well, we don't know. Use cases, we're not sure, right? So what do? We try to incorporate it, we try to analyze it. Here we looked, for instance, at all the articles that were written around blockchain for the past year, and there were thousands of articles. You know, and there were people talking about industry applications across the board in everything we teach our students. This is not a technology question. This is a finance or trading question, a healthcare question, an energy sector question. Companies that are working in the area, too many to mention, right? And very little general information. How do we teach them, even if we don't know the answer, how to navigate these sort of things for themselves? Then habits and permeability. Big questions, ambiguity, speed to capability, unlearning things, habits and permeability. And I'll try now to move into what we're doing as a school, to showcase what we're doing as a school, more importantly. I think constant exposure is the key. We try to build relationships with our students that go on far beyond what we teach them in class in those days. Right, one of the things that we do, we have a new initiative called Sydney Business Insights, shameless plug, which I run. Where we try to tell students about the future of business. We talk about these megatrends. We teach them how to understand the future, how to create it, lead it, manage it, but also how to imagine the future. And we give them a myriad of resources. We have 50,000 alumni, which we engage with, and we tell them the world is changing extremely fast, but we're there with you. And all of our resources, by the way, are free Creative Commons license, so please copy them shamelessly and help us build more of them. So open invitation to everyone here or everyone who's watching this. Shameless plug for a bit more. We give them podcasts. So every single week we reach out to our students with 2 or more podcasts where we invite people from industry to talk to us. We invite researchers to share their insights with us. But we also analyze the business news as they happen. And we use our researchers to say, well, this is what we think, and we don't understand it, but this is how it fits in with everything else that we do. So we talk about robo-lawyers or self-driving cars, or last week, you know, Amazon decided finally, officially, to come to Australia at 6 o'clock in the morning. So at 10 o'clock that morning, we did a podcast on what does that mean for customers, for small business, for large business, for government, for tax. Okay. I'm almost at the last one. Technology, for us and for them. And there are so many ways you could take technology, and Christian's taking it in one direction. I'm going to try to complement that by saying how we use technology. It hasn't changed very much. It's a tool, right? So people make technology out to be this fantastic thing, but it's embedded in the social cultural practices that we have. And it really hasn't changed very much. Actually, yes. Thank you to Daniel Dennett from where I stole that shamelessly. Technology has changed a little bit. So the little bit that it has changed, we use it. So we have online platforms where we share stuff with our students, and it might be me doing the same thing I'm doing now, talking passionately about things that I'm interested in. But we also ask them questions, and we personalize the learning for them. If they make a mistake when they're listening to this, if they make a mistake, we correct the mistake, but we also show them videos or other content that is aimed exactly at the mistake that they have done, so we fix that. We also bring them industry insights. So for instance, here we have case studies from industry. We have critical thinking, latest research that is being done in that area in our school. But we also bring in industry speakers to actually answer the same questions that we asked our students, to give them the latest on that. So if I'm asking my students to analyze the strategy that Qantas has going into Vietnam, I can then bring in the chief economist from Qantas to answer the same questions and talk to the students as to how they decided on these things on their strategy day. So we find different ways to interact with them. And we give them an opportunity to talk. And sometimes we step out. We found that the biggest thing that makes a difference in people using forums online was to call them peer discussion rather than discussion. If it's peer discussion, then they expect that each other will answer, and they share a lot more than if we call them just discussion, they wait for us to get involved. And then we check what they do. We actually know the course progress for each and every one of our students. We know what they're doing right now, so if they're falling behind, I know in week 2 that they're making mistakes or falling behind, and I can help them out. So personalized learning. I know exactly what they're doing and when they're not doing it. So those bad emails, hello, John, I see you haven't accessed your resources this morning. They hate us. But it helps us give them unique learning experience even in that technology space. Then students as co-creators. I think Christian has spoken about how to get people, students involved, and we have these wonderful places to get students involved in solving real-world problems, and I'll get to that in a minute. And our partners also as co-creators of content. The learning experience should not just be driven by us. Part of that meaning making is also that our students drive our learning experiences, even in assessment. So this is one of the assessments that we have in one of our classes, is asking students to create a concept video around something within the future of business. Some of them do disruptive innovation, or some of them might talk about smart cities. Best question my student ever asked was, when do you know that the city has become smart? Wonderful question, right? When do you know? We talk about smart cities, but when do you go from a normal city to a smart city? So they had a conversation about that. And then we embed them back into the curriculum. This is the assessment that they had. My videos are not working for some reason, but I will just talk through it. So we have students talking not only about concept videos, but I force them to talk about something that they struggle to understand and how they work their way through it. So the hardest thing, the thing that they really hated in the unit, they must tell me how they worked through that. Right? Yes, she's scared. But she got a really good mark. Then using our partners as co-creators, and all of you do that. But we want to reach out behind. These are, by the way, the organizations that were involved in one unit that we teach in 2 semesters. That's it. So it goes far beyond that. But we look beyond our networks of partners. We talk, for instance, to the Australian Navy about how the Navy does innovation. The Army and the Navy are a business. They're in the business of killing people, you know, sanctioned violence. But violence nonetheless, right? But we talk about how do you do innovation in an organization that is rule-bound, that is hierarchical, that does not want to take any risks. And we bring that to our students. So reach out to our partners to create those learning experiences. And our students worked, you know, on specific cases. They worked with Airbnb on the concrete manifestation of those megatrends. They worked with Airbnb on the future of the sharing economy in the city of Sydney, in a particular suburb, and they looked at the economic impacts of Airbnb in that area. Again, video not working. And then we have completely novel forms of engagement. When we try to reimagine education, we do it from scratch, right? 2 years ago, and I'm going to talk a little bit about pop-ups and hackathons. This is an example. Again, there are a million things we could discuss here. Pop-ups and hackathons, the refugee crisis was first and foremost on everybody's mind. We were down in Australia, quite far from where everything else was happening. But we looked at that and we said, okay, let's think about how we could develop and bring that learning into the curriculum. Well, if we did it a traditional way, it would take, you know, at best 6 months, normally 12 to 18 months to bring it into a curriculum. We brought it into the curriculum in less than a month. We developed short, focused, problem-based units. This was a 4-day class where we brought together NGOs, we brought together settlement services, business mentors, venture capitalists, academics, and the students to think about how we could help refugee entrepreneurs and refugee business owners when they come to Australia. It worked so fantastically well, and our students worked with refugees from a variety of places. It worked so fantastically well that the students in 4 days, using design thinking and all the fancy things that we could throw at them, Post-its mostly, they developed this 6-week or 7-week course, which then they delivered to refugees. No one paid them. They didn't get any brownie points for doing this, but they found meaning and they found value in that. So they worked alongside that. They were on radio and TV and a million other places, and their learning experience continued. So breaking down those barriers between what we normally do and how life is in general.
So what did you...
Well, now you work. So I want to end on looking to the future. This is probably the thing that I'm most passionate about, because all the things that I've spoken about before, we have to do, right? We have to do to be able to keep up with what's happening out there. This one, I hope we do. When I say look at the future of business, I think differently. So for me, looking at the future of business is imagining that future of business. I actually think that we have a responsibility to imagine radically different future and imagine what these disruptions will mean. Imagine that in a academically rigorous way, but imagine it nonetheless. Should the smartphone be a human right? If all our lives are moving on to smartphones, should this be a human right? Should we think about whether everyone should get a smartphone? What if a trip to Mars costs the same as getting a new car? What if 20% of the roads on our cars are autonomous vehicles? And by the way, Australia leads the world in autonomous vehicles. Not cars, vehicles. We have the most autonomous vehicles of anywhere in the world. We've got mines, we've got ports, we've got agriculture that's automated. So we need to think about that. And imagine that future. I mean, not only what does it mean for privacy and for car companies and insurance and so on, but what does it mean for real estate prices in the CBD when I no longer have to park my cars? And we have people in finance who are imagining just that. So we do that. We did, for instance, what happens if we have Arctic-free summers? What does that mean for global trade? And we force our students to think through the implications of those radically different futures so they can then create it. We talked about the rise of robo-lawyers, and we looked at how industries are changing. If you no longer have that structure where the profession helps the people coming into the profession, what does that mean for finance, for insurance, for law? And we looked at the implications of autonomous vehicles, and by God, they are cool. You have to come to Australia. So I will leave you with that thought. How will you reimagine business education? I think it's a fantastical challenge. I can think of no better time to be an academic, actually. So thank you very much for bearing with me.
Thank you, Sandra. So celebrate ambiguity, practice agility.
Myself.
While she unwires, I'm going to invite Christian to come up and join us at the huddle in the corner here, because we're going to now give you a chance to ask questions of our presenters. So get your thinking caps on. We've got 25 minutes for this to happen.